me. Heather, thank you so much for your time. So to begin, would you be able to speak a little bit to your work and your background to give students, young professionals who are interested in what you do, an idea of how you got to your current position and what you do for work?
Great question. It's taken a winding road, so maybe that will give hope to people who aren't quite sure what they want to do yet. But I did my undergrad at the U of S, grew up in Saskatchewan, and did like a Guatemala term abroad. And I always like to say this, back in my day, what white girl liberals wanted to do was, save the world through international development. And now they would do climate change. So back in my day, it was, very much about development, and my undergrad was focused on that. And I went, to Africa and Latin America and those kinds of things. And that was my focus. And that still colors what I do today, because I still think economic development and poverty are the biggest issues. So that's, so now I do it more on the Indigenous side in Canada, Northern development, Arctic development. And when I look at resource development, it is still through that lens of not only opportunities for Indigenous people and opportunities for Northern development and self-determination, but also the provision of cheap goods, the basic goods we need, the commodities we need for all 8 billion people to live. So now, so I did my undergrad at the U of S, I did my master's at the Memorial University of Newfoundland, did my thesis research in South America and Chile. And then I worked in Geneva for 8 months as an intern at an NGO, working on small arms and disarmament, actually. But of course, conflict is a symptom of poverty, really, in many cases. And then I came back to Canada, worked for something called University Arctic. So it was really about Northern education, distributed education, and a consortium of universities, including the University of Saskatchewan, to offer more opportunities to Northerners and to kind of consolidate some Northern research. And then I did my PhD at the University of Calgary. Dr. Rob Hubert was my supervisor. So I focused more on Arctic security, Arctic human security. And then I went back to the U of S, worked at the International Center for Northern Governments and Development. And that's where I kind of pieced together kind of the Arctic and the Northern and the Indigenous and the development pieces. And today I work at a think tank in Ottawa. I live in Calgary, but the think tank's in Ottawa. I'm the director of energy, natural resources, and environment. And I also have a few other affiliations, but that's my main job.
So I'm super interested because you said you did some work in Latin America when you were younger. Again, pure coincidence. I did a trip to Costa Rica last summer where I was working at a university down there. So just out of curiosity, what other countries did you work at when you were there? So I
did my undergrad, I was in Guatemala for a term abroad. And then for my master's, I was in Chile. And then I've traveled through Bolivia and Peru, and I've been to Costa Rica and Cuba and El Salvador and I'm missing one, Nicaragua. Had to go through the there. So, and I thought, I was like, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to, go to conferences on beaches and have margaritas, and it got turned over to the Arctic. So now I go to cold places instead.
That's great. So my next question, so in your work, you talk a lot about the idea of energy security. Would you be able to tell us how, in your view, energy security compares to traditional conceptualizations of security?
Traditional conceptualizations of the which? Of security?
Of security.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, like just traditional security versus energy security.
Yeah, so I always like to picture this. We sometimes forget the history of things. And energy security used to be traditional security not long ago. When you think of every Middle Eastern war of the 20th century, that was traditional, and it was energy security. And we've only forgotten that in the last 10 or 15 years as kind of environmentalism and concerns with climate change, legitimate concerns have arisen, but also energy has been cheap for the last 12 years. And so why is that? It was the shale revolution of horizontal drilling and fracking. And it turned America from the world's biggest importer of oil, where they did have to have all these networks and they had to have kind of client governments in the Middle East, into the world's biggest producer of oil. So in terms of the landscape of energy security, which is traditional security, is totally upended by this reversal of the American position in this situation. But now we're starting to see that change where shale is soon to plateau and decline. And global consumption has gone up. And then we have, the disruptions with Russia and that kind of thing. And oil will start to become more expensive again. And for the last, 8 years, I think it averaged about $60 a barrel, kind of a little bit lower, a little bit higher. And really before that, people don't realize that for the few years before that, it was about $100 a barrel. So this era of cheap oil was very good, cheap energy for human development, kind of went from 7 to 8 billion people. And now that's changing. So I think it was easy to forget that energy security wasn't traditional security the last few years, but for the 100 years before, it was a very clear linkage. And so now I see it as a return to, traditional security. And we're going to see that with critical minerals too. So people say, oh, we need to get off of fossil fuels because it creates these wars, it creates this dependence on authoritarian regimes like Russia. We don't want to be dependent on them. And that is true. But the flip side of being dependent on other sources, on renewables and also nuclear energy, is that they're very mining intensive. And critical minerals, and we say critical minerals, I'm thinking of copper, nickel, lithium, manganese. Those are kind of the traditional ones that we think about, rare earth elements. They are geographically concentrated. And so in most of those cases, there's 3 or 4 countries that have, 70 or 80% of global production. And the Chinese will have another monopoly on the processing and refining. They'll import those raw materials and process it, refining before they send it to everyone else. So in fact, critical minerals and renewables are probably more prone to disruptions and supply chain insecurity than fossil fuels are, because natural gas, and refining capacity are available on every continent. Even if there's some distortions and some importers and exporters, it's available everywhere. So energy security will only become more of an issue as we move into a low carbon economy.
Oh, great answer. That was even more than I expected. What would you say is unique about Canada's energy? So this is a big question, by the way, so a lot of ways you can answer this one. But what would you say is unique? What would you say is unique about Canada's energy capabilities, and how can these capabilities be used to advance Canada's values and interests?
So I'm going to be working on this the next year, this exact question. So look at Canada's position. We are in such an enviable position. We're the second largest country and only 40 million people. So we can really be just wildly rich, first of all, with resource rents, and also influential in the world. So some things I like to point out, for example, is that of the OECD, kind of all the developed countries, the Western developed countries, Canada is the only one in the top 10 of reserves that is in the OECD. The other 9 of the top 10 reserves are OPEC countries, at OPEC plus. So it is very important that Canada continue to play a role in producing oil in particular. We're also the world's, I think, 5th largest producer of natural gas, even though 99% of it gets exported to the United States that we don't use. And then, of course, all the critical minerals. We have, all the critical minerals that we deem critical. So we are a resource powerhouse, but we have never used it strategically. And that's the point I want us to start thinking about in Canada and making, is how can we become an energy superpower? How do we use this natural resource endowment in a way that advances our interests and our values? And we're in this odd situation where actually G7 and EU and other allies are coming to us, asking us to produce more, to sell them more at a profit. And we're still kind of dilly-dallying in Canada that, our prime minister said, we want you to know us for our resourcefulness, not for our resources, as if it's some sort of shame or it's some sort of second-class economy to be known for, resource extraction. So we are a superpower. We are a huge producer in oil, in natural gas, a huge hydro power. But of course, you can only really export that one way to the south or use it in Canada. So we do hydroelectric too. And pretty soon, I'm from Saskatchewan, on the nuclear energy side, that we are a uranium superpower also. And uranium is particularly geologically concentrated. The great news is it's geologically concentrated in Saskatchewan and Australia and Kazakhstan. So between Canada and Australia, we could honestly meet our allies' nuclear energy needs, uranium needs for centuries. We really could. It's from an energy security perspective, nuclear is a no-brainer because we have so much of that great uranium in these very friendly countries. So looking in the next year, and what I'm going to be working on is what would be a strategy to make Canada into an energy and resource superpower, and then what would be the benefits of that? How would we use that power? And if you've ever heard of Iran or Iraq or Kuwait or Venezuela in the news, it's because they have oil. They have used their oil assets in such a strategic way that they are globally significant, that we have to have foreign policies about them, that we have to think about them. And why isn't Canada at least as strategic with our own oil reserves as an Iran is? When we have more even. So thinking about that very carefully, someone in the G7, someone in the OECD has to be exporting these goods. It can't just be authoritarian countries that are controlling these markets.
Again, great, even better than of an answer than I expected, and I had high expectations. So awesome. So much of your work looks at the Arctic region specifically and energy security. Would you be able to elaborate on what people and country reside in the Arctic and why this region is so crucial for global energy security?
So often from a foreign policy perspective, we think of 8 countries that are members of the Arctic Council. So it's Canada, the United States because of Alaska, Denmark because of Greenland, Sweden, Finland, and Norway, and Russia and Iceland. So those 8 countries. And there's another way to look at it too, is the 5 around the Arctic Ocean. So that would be Russia, United States, Canada, Denmark, and Norway. Where if you're looking at kind of some of the marine aspects. So a little bit different way to look at it. Why is it important? I mean, every region is important. Traditionally, the Arctic has been important because, at least in the last 100 years, it's between us and Russia. And since the Cold War, it's the shortest, route for a missile from Russia to hit North America and vice versa. And so in terms of the time that you need to deter and prepare for a nuclear attack, that was the most vulnerable position, was over the pole. And so that's why we had, NORAD and the DEW line and kind of the early warning is that we're concerned about missiles coming over the top and having less time to react. And that's still a concern. That's still why we're, interested in modernizing NORAD. And that's kind of the first thing the Americans ask us to do, is to protect the continent. And here it's important to distinguish, we're not protecting the Arctic. It's not that we think the Arctic will be attacked. It's that it's going to have to go over the Arctic to attack the continent, to attack North America. And so that's a vulnerability, and we need to, have, very good domain awareness and monitoring and that kind of thing. So the Arctic's important from that perspective. People often say it's also important for resources. We talk about a race for resources and an Arctic boom. And almost every single article about the Arctic you'll ever read starts off with a paragraph of, it has oil and gas and minerals, and these countries are fighting over it, or there's a race for it. And that part isn't actually true. And I don't know why it keeps getting repeated, but yes, there are resources. There's, of course, there's tremendous resources. It's a big region and largely untapped, but they are extremely expensive to extract. And so, Russia has a tremendous, look at Russia's the world's biggest country. Canada's second largest big country. We don't need each other's territory. I don't need to invade Russia. They don't need to invade Canada. We both have these vast swaths of land. So does Alaska, so does Greenland. That's pretty much just untapped because it's not economical to tap it. It's not economical to take it out. So the few areas where we do have oil and LNG on Alaska, Norway, and Russia tend to be the ice-free areas. And Canada is mostly the ice area. That there's very little in the Canadian archipelago that doesn't freeze over the winter. But there are warmer currents in Norway and Alaska and Russia where it literally doesn't freeze all year because they have a warm current. So those were the first places to exploit. In terms of the minerals, again, taking Canada as an example, no roads, no transmission, no workforce. If you're taking out copper, nickel, and iron, you need railways. At the very least, you need roads. And this is just extremely expensive to do on melting permafrost over muskeg. So we do need those critical minerals. There are ways to get them, but it is expensive. And that's why the region hasn't attracted investment. when people say, well, it's, climate change and it's melting, it's true, the sea ice is melting. But if you're a mining company, that is not even in the top 5 of the costs that you're concerned about. Most deposits aren't within 100 kilometers of the Northwest Passage. Even if they were, the Northwest Passage is only ice-free for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months. But the costs are in the labor, in the building, in the energy. You don't have, you're not connected to any grids. You have to build a road. So what I like to say is, the Arctic is becoming slightly less inaccessible. It's not becoming accessible. That winter still comes. It's still dark for 6 months a year. The ice always comes back, and it'll always be a very expensive jurisdiction. So there is a lot of hype. It's never been met. Commodity prices today are not enough to spur a lot of Arctic development, but they are still there. And at some point in the next few decades, we'll probably want to get at them.
So this is a little bit of a follow-up to that answer that I think transitions smoothly. So I know that a non-Arctic country, China, has been trying to exert its influence in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. Would you be able to speak to what China's activities are in the Arctic as it relates to resource development, the Arctic Belt and Road, and how China's Arctic activities will influence or impact Canada?
So again, China is probably our biggest adversary. That's probably what keeps the Pentagon up at night and D&D up at night, more so even than Russia, although both would keep them up at night and a lot of things keep them up at night. So I'm not here to diminish the threat of China, but to say that in the Arctic, it's probably been a little bit overblown in the same ways I described before. So when we look at, people say climate change drives development in the Arctic. No, commodity prices drive development in the Arctic. And so when we saw the Chinese interest was the last commodities boom phase, 2006 to 2014. And the Chinese were looking everywhere, and they were, growing at an extremely fast pace, 8-9% a year. They had that demographic dividend from their one-child policy, which is now becoming a liability. But at that time, they were growing very fast, had a ravenous appetite, and we're looking in the Arctic, and commodity prices were even supporting the idea of building in the Arctic, that you could be profitable. And then then we had a bust. And so people have looked at it. There's 2 great reports that came out last fall from RAND and FOI, a Swedish think tank, actually looking at evaluating what Chinese investments are there. And while there's a lot of interest in some proposals and some exploration a decade ago, almost none of that actually came to fruition. And a part of that too is that the Nordic countries and Canada and the United States aren't that friendly to Chinese investment anymore. There's a lot of scrutiny. So there's almost no Chinese investment in the North American or Nordic Arctic. The Chinese have even been pulling out, for example, some oil sands projects. Where the money is going is Russia. And we don't want Russia and China to get along so well, but they do. But it makes perfect sense because actually Russia is right beside China. And so from a geographic perspective, it's easier to build the pipeline, it's easier to build a railroad, it's shorter to ship it. It actually makes a lot of sense. And Russia is on the decline, the population's on the decline, they need that investment. There's nowhere else for Russia to go now for investment. China is willing to provide it, and it's right nearby. But the other thing about that is that almost all of the actual money, the billions of dollars that has been spent by China in the Arctic, is almost all Russian LNG. And again, it's not so much about the Arctic, it's about LNG, and they would get it from anywhere. It happens to be in the Russian Arctic. So it's not the Arctic that's driving it or climate change that's driving it. It just happens to be a massive resource that happens to be in the Russian Arctic. So we talk about an Arctic boom, we're talking about a Russian LNG boom. That's where it's happening, and that's where Chinese investment has gone.
Super interesting. So going on to Russia now. So the unavoidable topic when discussing energy security right now is the impact of the war in Ukraine. How has the war in Ukraine impacted resource development and energy security, well, in Canada and the Arctic as well? Actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to skip. I had these questions written down. I'm going to skip that one based on your previous answer.
Oh, I have another answer for that. I have a good one for that.
Okay, yeah, okay. I'll finish the question then.
Okay.
Okay. I'll repeat that then. The unavoidable question, or the unavoidable topic when discussing energy security is the impact of the war in Ukraine. How has the war in Ukraine impacted resource development and energy security in Canada specifically and the Arctic region as a whole?
And I'm going to even broader it and say globally. So it has had a massive impact in that we had a really great 20, 30 year of increasing globalization, where there was freer trade. China wasn't our friend, but we wanted to trade with them. Their presence has increased everywhere, huge market, Asian markets growing. In terms of, from an economic theory perspective, it was a pretty positive period of globalization and free trade, and goods became cheaper. We were rationalizing the trading process, and things became cheaper. And now we will see that this, March 2022 is a line in the sand of a time where we started to see a decline of globalization, or a reversal of globalization, where the United States and the EU and Canada and others are saying, we need to friendshore, we need to nearshore, we need to secure supply chains. The American investment in China, I just saw some stats last week, had declined by 42% in the last year. So a massive reorientation away from investing with Russia and China and towards more friendly countries. This is going to benefit countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, and it'll probably benefit Canada as well. Because again, our allies are all coming to us saying, we need to get, some of your critical minerals and some of your energy that we were getting from some unfriendly countries, not least Russia. Russia has a lot of what Canada has in terms of kind of global monopolies, is potash for fertilizer, uranium, although they mostly have enriched uranium, and then wheat, canola, and of course, oil and gas. So a lot of what people are trying to get off of Russia for, Canada is a natural answer to. So we are seeing that reorientation. It'll take time, and also it'll be expensive. The reason why people were buying from Russia and China is because it was the cheapest. That was the major concern. That was providing the cheapest goods. And as we reorient and try to go to friendlier or near sources, and it makes sense, you can see what happens to the European Union when they rely just on Russia. You do need to account for the security to some extent. There is a premium to have that security supply. You pay dearly if you don't have it. But everything, as we retreat from globalization, everything will become more expensive. Canada should benefit from this trend, but the world will probably suffer as a whole.